was a watershed event in the long struggle for voter rights, one that unfolded on television screens across the nation and left an indelible mark on American history. Today, it is remembered as Bloody Sunday for the brutal assault inflicted upon a group of peaceful demonstrators as they marched for racial justice and equal access to the ballot box. But we also remember the courage and moral determination of those who stood for justice in a time of ruthless adversity. The shocking events of March 7, 1965 would go on to cement the civil rights movement throughout the country and set the stage for landmark reforms. The 1965 Voter Rights Act only a few months later. That day in March is commemorated in Selma, Alabama, and across the nation each year to emphasize the struggle for voter rights. Kentucky joined the commemoration in the state capitol in Frankfort as a reminder that democracy strives when every eligible voter has a fair opportunity to vote and to fight against voter suppression. The event in 1965 started when hundreds of demonstrators gathered in Selma, preparing to embark on a multi-day 54-mile march to the Alabama Capitol in Montgomery. Several months earlier, Congress had passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but the legacy of Jim Crow continued to cast a long shadow over much of the South, especially in Dallas County, where voter registration among Black Americans remained exceedingly low and voter intimidation ran high. At the time, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was ramping up efforts to increase registration among Black voters in the county seat of Selma. Only about 2% of the African American population was registered to vote there in 1964. But the efforts drew steep opposition from segregationist authorities who jailed thousands of demonstrators by February 1965. That same month, a 26-year-old African-American man named Jimmy Lee Jackson was fatally shot by a state trooper during a peaceful march for voting rights in a neighboring county. Amid the abuses, civil rights leaders, both local and national, called for a march on the state capitol, seeking to draw attention to the brutality and injustices that had resulted in Jackson's death. But efforts to thwart the movement were also growing more intense. Alabama Governor George Wallace condemned the planned demonstration as a public safety threat and ordered state troopers to prevent it through whatever means necessary. On the day of the march, around 600 demonstrators, led by future Congressman John Lewis, among others, left the Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma and headed several blocks toward the Alabama River. As the group crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they squared off with a large contingent of law enforcement and local civilians who had been deputized that day by militant Sheriff Jim Clark.
Here, advance toward the group.
See that they disperse.
The violence that followed would appall the country and galvanize support for reforms. Police began assaulting the marchers with billy clubs and tear gas. Others rode through the crowd on horseback. One of the organizers, Amelia Boynton, was beaten unconscious, while John Lewis suffered a skull fracture. In all, more than 50 marchers were hospitalized with injuries from the assault. The bloodshed was documented by television crews and journalists covering the march and transmitted to millions of homes across America.
With nightsticks and tear gas.
It spurred outcry and demonstrations across the country and awakened many to join the fight for civil rights. Just days later, President Lyndon B. Johnson introduced federal legislation that was destined to become the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a measure he signed into law that August.
We shall overcome.
And civil rights leaders, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., organized 2 more marches from Selma in the ensuing weeks. The final march ended with 25,000 people demonstrating at the Alabama State Capitol on March 25th. That day, Dr. King delivered his now famous "How long, not long" speech on the Capitol steps.
I come to say to you this afternoon, however difficult the moment, yes, sir, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth crushed earth will rise again. Yes, sir. How long? Not long. Yes, sir. Because no lie can live forever. Yes, sir. How long? Not long. How long? Because you shall reap what you sow. Yes, sir. How long? Not long. How long? Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Yes, sir.
2 years ago, the Kentucky SELMA Commemoration Coalition came together to reenact the events of Bloody Sunday and rally for voter participation at the Kentucky Capitol. The Kentucky Legislative Black Caucus was a key organizer and a driving force as hundreds of supporters marched from Main Street and down Capitol Avenue in solidarity with the SELMA event, along with others commemorating the event around the nation. The marchers crossed the War Mothers Memorial Bridge and proceeded to the Capitol steps with Governor Andy Beshear and an original participant from the march in 1965 as a symbolic representation of the SELMA events. In addition, panels and related commemorations coordinated their focus on voter rights across the Commonwealth. Rather than attacks and hostility, the group was welcomed by the Frankfort community. And while there was much change to celebrate, it was an important reminder about a dark period in our collective history. One recognizing that expanding the vote is as relevant today to ensure a vibrant and inclusive democracy. This year marks the 57th anniversary of the SELMA March, and the legacy of that day informs our future just as much as our past. When we look back to that Sunday in 1965, we must ask ourselves, who among us would cross that bridge today? Who among us would stand for justice against such insurmountable odds? Because in Kentucky and across America, the struggle continues for a new generation, and many more bridges lay ahead.